quiz is progressively more points gives us more chances to
Yeah,
bring up our grade.
that's the point, you know. Hey, we're here. It's the recording. It is October 13th. October 13th already of 2025. Yeah, we were just talking in class about the last quiz where I wrote a question that asked you to write about the future of life instead of the actual assigned reading, which was Cradle to Cradle. So my apologies if you're watching the recording. If you answered for either book, I'm going to give credit for it. Totally okay. All right. Also, yeah, this is our last reading assignment coming up here, where you're going to be reading Stuff, The Secret Life of Everyday Things. And then the remainder of the course, the last two quizzes will be entirely on lecture material. So quiz 4, November 2nd, we're looking at the syllabus for those of you watching the recording. Quiz 4 will be on stuff. We'll have a question on stuff. Quiz 5 and quiz 6 will both be just lecture, multiple choice questions. And then the final is, it's only 50 points. It's going to be 25 questions equally drawn from each of the previous quizzes. I know 50 is not perfect. I can find a way to make it divisible by 6, you know? Equally drawn from the previous quizzes, 25 questions. All right, 25 is not divisible by 6, so we'll make it work, okay? And they'll be randomly drawn from the previous quizzes. So you should be able to review your previous quizzes now, see which ones you missed. It doesn't show you the correct answer, but if you ever want to chat about any of the questions on the previous quizzes, you can set up a meeting with me or show up to office hours, and I'll help you out with that. Any questions there about that stuff? Okay, cool. Let's get back into our course material. We're talking about biodiversity loosely. Now we're talking about conservation, and usually conservation projects, their main stated goal is to maintain or increase biodiversity. So that's how it all ties together. We've got this week, then next week, we'll just make sure we're all caught up on materials. Then we'll move into ecological economics. Quiz 4 will be on week 7 through 8 PowerPoint. Awesome, and stuff. Not stuff, the word, but the book stuff. We're all on the same page here. It's raining a lot today. Cool. I'd love it to calm down because I learned this morning that my gutters apparently aren't draining properly, so I have to figure that out. And if it rains too much, I get water damage, which is the constant bane of anybody here with a house in this area. Cool. So let's get back into the stuff. We are beginning on slide 33 for those of you watching the recording in the week 7 through 8 PowerPoint. And this slide was about habitat characteristics for invasion success. So I mentioned this on the species conservation or species characteristics slide, that I'm not asking you to memorize all of these bullet points, right? You can reference this on your quiz or your final, but you should look at these bullet points and see why they make sense, why these characteristics make sense for making a species better at becoming an invasive species. All right, so some of them are really intuitive, and I mentioned in the previous one how a lot of these characteristics sync up with those R-selected species that we talked about previously, right? Those rudderole species, the weedy species that are good at getting in there and colonizing after disturbance. Great. Also, polyphagy means eating many things. Loss of natural enemies we talked about with the enemy release hypothesis, where if you move into a new habitat and your enemies aren't there, you're going to do better. Like your predators aren't there anymore, or your main competitors aren't there anymore. I gave you the example of frogs becoming more and more poisonous as snakes become more and more resistant to the poison. Then that poisonous frog gets moved to a new area, and it's been building up these high levels to contend with the resistance in its predator. But now the predators have no resistances, and then the population can just can get out of control. Okay, cool. Invasion meltdown. And then, of course, Just because a species has some of these characteristics does not mean it will be a good invasive species. Evidence is not always supportive and sometimes contradictory. We went through these habitat characteristics as well. I ended with talking about connectance of the food web, all right, which we discussed a little bit when we were talking about food webs exist, and you've seen pictures of them before. But if you modify a food web and you add some values over the arrows, you can actually get more information. It's more informative. It doesn't just need to be the bird eats these 4 things. You could talk about the rate of predation and the population growth rates. All this information can be included, and the degree of connectance of a food web is actually a pretty good predictor. It has a pretty strong correlation with stability of an ecosystem. If there are many species, or regardless of the number of, ooh, that chalk. You know soft chalk? You ever write with that and it sets your teeth off? Oh, it's horrible. It's like, I can't. Here, we need this. Okay. So when you have a community with different populations, if there's a high degree of connectance, that means that all of the species are, either consuming one another or being consumed by one another in some way. We need another arrow going like this. All right. And then they have another arrow going like this. All right. So there are all these possible connections in a food web, and the higher proportion of them are realized, and the higher the proportion realized is, the higher a connectance value becomes. And it's nothing too complicated, right? It's just which proportion of possible connections in a food web are actually realized. Is it 60%? Is it 80%? The community with an 80% connectance rate is likely to be more stable. All right? Because one species, an invasive species, could come and knock one of these individuals out, right? Or a disturbance could come and remove one, or human activities could remove one species, and everyone's got a backup. You see why that would make a habitat or a community more stable? Awesome. All right. Are all non-native species bad? Well, of course, the phrase bad, it's really common to think of invasive species as always a negative thing. But there are instances when non-native species can serve essential roles. So there are plenty of examples from island systems where a pollinator goes extinct and then an invasive species is introduced, which takes over the pollination function and can save an endangered native species. So that's a good example of a non-native and invasive species maybe becoming negative, okay, or becoming positive. I'm so sorry. So non-native, was it here originally? I mentioned briefly about how do we define if a species was originally here or not. And that definition matters, because if you define a species as invasive, it has all of these connotations, it has all these meanings. And if we think about all non-native species as having a negative environmental impact, then we avoid opportunities for conservation, or we have conservation projects that are designed purely to remove non-native species, and then the community collapses because it's become reliant on it. Yes? Absolutely. Yeah. So when we talked about this right here, we talked about the trend towards becoming invasive, and we talked about naturalized. Introduced, a species is introduced, it's non-native, right? Naturalized, it becomes, sorry, please. Yes. Yeah, you can absolutely have naturalized non-native species. Yep. If it doesn't have any predators consuming it, if the other species can't compete with it, if it doesn't interact with the other components of the food web, then its population can just explode as it gets released, as it's acting sort of outside of the ecosystem. It's a good point. Thank you. Yes?
Would it still be considered a native species? For example, like the California, or not California, the American chestnut tree. Like they're like breeding it with, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would it still be considered native after their whole process? If it fulfills the same ecological niche.
And the point, the real kicker is it depends on who you ask, right? Because it's very reasonable to say if it fulfills the same ecological niche, it's great. It fit back into the system was vacant of that niche. But depending on which agency or bill or grant you're working under, a species that underwent extirpation or local extinction in an area may now be considered non-native if it's reintroduced. And if there's been a breeding program to make it more resilient and then you reintroduce it, you need to be aware of all the nuance here, right? Of what are you really trying to do? And that kind of ties it back in with the whole PowerPoint of biodiversity. We usually justify things by saying, oh, we're maintaining biodiversity. So reintroducing that species, if it helps to continue to foster biodiversity, then we could say, oh, it's not a harmful introduced species, but does the bill that we have that gives this preserve protections require that there be no species introductions? Because if that's written in there, then it really depends on how we define these things. When you know, it's
a big wraparound.
Yeah. And it's so much. It's so important how we define these terms. It's so important. Yeah.
So is invasive species the umbrella term, or is it non-native species?
Non-native species is the umbrella wraparound term.
And so there's invasive species and then there's good non-native species.
Yeah. Usually invasive implies that the population is exploding out of control and that it's able to spread out of that area.
Okay.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I see that we're kind of picking up on that pattern of there's these big umbrella terms. And oftentimes when we're talking about the big umbrella, we end up talking about a subcategory of the big umbrella term as if it's the umbrella term, like in our evolution example, right? And that makes us lose some of the nuance that's available to discuss that. Anyways, I'm super stoked about this. Oh, another cool example, nesting habitats, all right? You go through, you remove the native species, like shrublands, you remove a bunch of shrubs or heath rows or things like that, and then there's no nesting habitats for birds in a given area, but all the birds really need is a structure in which to nest. So oftentimes a non-native species can fulfill that same role as nesting habitat. Now, does it still provide a food source and increase connectedness of the food web? Does it provide a resource for pollinators? Or does it only provide nesting habitat? How not bad is the non-native species? Anyways.
If it just does nesting habitats, would it be considered more invasive, even though it's still...
So, yeah, totally. So it would become invasive if the population begins to spread and go out of control, right? So if it's the more roles it plays in the ecosystem, the more likely that it's going to be connected to other components of the ecosystem, and the more likely that the natural processes are going to be able to manage the population size. So it actually hits a carrying capacity and then does this. If the population, it doesn't just go whoop, yeah. We want it to go whoa, 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 whoa. Yeah, yep, yes.
I always had the idea that invasive meant just taking resources from other things in the ecosystem, but is it the actual definition is basically about population?
The actual definition is about population size and the lack of control on it, and that it can spread. It's become fully adapted to the area, and the population is growing rapidly, and it is starting to spread out of the area. So you can have exactly what was brought up earlier, right? You can have a non-native species that becomes naturalized, and it does well there, and it just grows a little bit, hits this little leg period where it undergoes local adaptation, and it just bounces around this. And it doesn't have to go whoop. It could just keep going wah, 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 and become an essential component of the ecosystem. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. I put a case study in here because when I was originally sort of structuring this course, I wanted to make sure like every lecture is going to have a cool big case study where we can really just discuss some actual real-world implications. And I didn't do that consistently. So this time, we're doing one. I guess I don't need to justify it, but I wanted to kind of explain why this doesn't fit into our normal structure and might feel like, wait, where's this coming from? It's from out of nowhere. So here we go. A cool case study of non-native species management with conservation implications. As with many ecological case studies, it illustrates not fully understanding the impacts of your intervention usually leads to you got to understand the impacts of your intervention or you get unintended consequences. So this, right? They introduce a virus into Switzerland in the 50s, the myxoma virus. It kills rabbits. They've got a huge rabbit issue. These rabbit species were introduced, all right? And so that's a non-native species, and they were trying to get rid of them by giving them a virus. That's pretty intense, but rabbit populations are notoriously difficult to manage and control. All right, so rabbit numbers decline, it works. 99% reduction in 3 years across mainland Britain. Boom, all right, success. We killed all the rabbits, all right? Fewer rabbits, the grasslands begin to come back, all right? Because they're feeding on that grassland. Now, these introduced rabbits, they've taken over that niche of consuming the grass, being the grazers. If you want to call grazers a functional role in the ecosystem, they've taken on that grazer functional role. But they're so good at reproducing. They're classic R strategists, right? Where they reproduce super rapidly, yeah? And so they've just been consuming all the resources, population's grown, boom, 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 it's an invasive species, they're spreading, classic. All right, then here's what happens. Because there is no more grazer in the ecosystem, the grasses start to get taller. No big deal, it's just more biomass, right? It'll go back into the cycle, everything will be cool, no worries. But there are ant species, okay? These ant populations need warm soil for their nests. The soil's getting too cold, all right? And somehow they notice this native butterfly called the large blue, it became extirpated, which remember is a local extinction. So it's a famous butterfly among, they're called, what are they, lepidopterists, right? They love this butterfly, the large blue. It goes away. Where'd all the large blues go? Well, what happened recently? Was there an ecological project? Well, we killed all the rabbits, but that doesn't make a ton of sense. Were the rabbits consuming the predators of these butterflies? Not necessarily. So here's the complicated life cycle of the large blue, which is actually dependent on ant nests. So check it out. You got this adult large blue butterfly. It is a large blue butterfly, but it's called the large blue. So you got that. It lays its eggs, all right? The larvae hatch. The larvae produce chemical signals that indicate to ants, I'm an ant baby, collect me and put me with your other ant babies, all right? They remove the larvae, they put them into the nest. It's really cool. The larva also then does sound mimicry to mimic the ants. It's very reliant on these ants, which then take it into its nest, and then the larvae grow and eat the ant babies, all right? So it's a butterfly parasitizing ants, which is pretty, not a very intuitive sort of system. And then the larvae have an opportunity to undergo pupation and become adults. They're in a nice protected area with lots of food, okay, it's really great for them. All right? So removal of the rabbits led to a change in the habitat, which changed the amount of ants and led to a complete extirpation of the large blue butterfly, which is very charismatic. People care about it, and so people were upset. Now they reintroduced the large blue butterfly, and management has changed, but I believe they didn't reintroduce the rabbits. I remember there's like a last button to put on this point, and I'm missing it as I'm explaining it to you. The point is they reintroduced the large blue, they supplemented the population regularly, and they do some sort of landscape management in order to encourage the ant populations. But it's just a cool example of they were just trying to get rid of some dang rabbits, and they killed a butterfly that people care about. Now, one thing I'd like you to think about is how important in the ecosystem was the large blue butterfly. All right? There's not really a discussion of that, but it's a super charismatic animal that people like. So that's one way that you can kind of get a management project moving, is with what they call a flagship species. Anyways, let's talk a little bit about human-caused reductions in biodiversity. We've already talked about, remember we had the HIPPO acronym, okay? And we already talked about invasive species, that's the I, all right? And now we're going to talk about human-caused reduction, okay? Which is going to include just commercial products and live specimens. So accessing animals, killing animals, or removing plants, harvesting plants for a product that's being used in some way, or for a component that's being used in some way. Now, when you're talking about these things, it's very tempting to say, well, then let's just not let humans access these resources anymore. But sometimes that's not actually significantly impacting the population anyway, and there needs to be a recognition of traditional uses of these resources, okay? So there's a classic example of American ginseng, where there's these native ginseng populations that are collected and used for medicinal purposes. They are also sold for medicinal purposes in some markets, all right? And when that population started to decline, and people were like, oh no, the population's declining, one of the initial calls was we need to stop people from harvesting that ginseng. Let's just say it's illegal to harvest the American ginseng now. But thankfully, they could do some ecological modeling and find that the amount of individuals that were actually being removed from the population from harvesting practices had a negligible impact on survival assessments. So the population viability analyses were done. They adjusted the take rate, the harvesting rate, and found that even if you reduce the harvesting rate by 100%, you don't significantly affect the viability of the population. So what was doing it? Deer. It was deer grazing. They did some cool ecological studies and found that there were deer that were eating all the American ginseng too aggressively. So what do? Well, the actual management practice that ended up being implemented was increased hunting permits for deer. And that worked pretty effectively. And now the American ginseng populations that were once threatened are growing again. So, I just bring that up because when you see a slide like this, it's very tempting to be like, yeah, we should probably stop the harvest of rhino horn, But it doesn't mean that all human use of resources necessarily needs to be cut off, or that it would actually do anything. You can actually observe results, model things, and find out. Anyway, commercial products, live specimens, these lead to human-caused reductions in biodiversity. We talked about the CITES Act very briefly when we talked about the when we were talking about the Red List, and the CITES Act deals in trade in endangered species and controls that. And it's like an agreement that many countries have entered into, some have codified to prevent the transport and trade of endangered species. All right, cool. All right, hunting and fishing laws. Yeah, so hunting practices are, or hunting permits are an example of management practices. You distribute hunting permits, you distribute a certain number of them, you try to control hunting rates, encourage it in some years, discourage it in other, and it's just always listed when you talk about in situ management of populations or communities. You try to get the right things taken. All right, it's a very pragmatic idea. It's been successful sometimes it's less successful. All right, cool. The Endangered Species Act. Let's talk about it. Because usually, all right, it's difficult to implement projects unless you can show that an endangered species is being impacted. All right? There's also endangered habitat types. And I know I've mentioned it quite a few times. Like, oh, there's also habitat types that are endangered. And it's something to consider because that same justification can be used to protect entire habitats. And if you've got the choice between protecting a single species in a habitat or protecting the entire habitat is probably going to protect that species as well. See what I'm saying? Anyways. So, terminology, basic terminology here. All right. Species get classified as endangered or under imminent danger of extinction. Endangered, they're about to go extinct. Threatened, they may become endangered. Vulnerable, they are just rare naturally in the ecosystem, or they have a low population size. Really, it's more just like the vulnerable might become threatened, the threatened might become endangered. Who defines all of these? Well, it's usually that big organization we were talking about. Back here, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, people usually defer to their red list, right? And I kind of went up on a little soapbox about, it's a big organization. We should be a little concerned if everybody is following their guidelines for what an endangered species is. But that's the list that the Endangered Species Act usually references. Question?
Isn't that kind of an idea that we've read about in the books?
Yeah. Yep. So it's come up there. It came up in the books. I forget. They all blend together for me. But yeah, they really are. So it's definitely something to consider, though. Okay. Awesome. Who enforces the Endangered Species Act? Well, we've got the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service. All right. As you can probably guess, one focuses more on terrestrial and freshwater habitats, and one focuses more on enforcement in marine habitats. All right. Cool. So, what does the Endangered Species Act do? If a species is classified as endangered, you can't take it. They call it a taking, okay? Where you harass it, you harm it, you hunt it, you shoot it, you trap it, you capture, you collect it, all right? No takings, okay? You sell it, you transport it, you ship it. No, can't do it, all right? You can't import it, you can't export it. And these rules apply to the whole organism, the body parts, or products made from the organisms. So you can't secretly take the animal or the plant and then process it, all right, and then take the products from that process and sell them either. If it can be demonstrated that they were taken from an endangered species. Yes, please.
Like if a cow was extinct, you couldn't take them. Is that what you mean?
Oh, yeah, so you can't. That's really fun. So the more textbook example is, oh, well, this piano has been shipped across countries, and it's like, oh, I got this cool piano, And then they say, well, I think this is actually authentic, real ivory, even though it was marketed as imitation ivory. And so then they go and they scrape it and they analyze it and they find, oh, well, this is a product made from an animal that is on the endangered species list, and therefore the trade of this is illegal just as is the trade of the animal itself. But I love the idea of if you have an endangered species, I mean, the milk is renewable, but then you're holding the animal, you're taking the animal by capturing it. So I don't think it would be allowed because of that. Yeah. Okay, awesome. Recovery plans. Recovery plans are if you get into the conservation world and you get into the really applied conservation world, you might be drafting recovery plans. And recovery plans are proposals to help a species come back from endangered to threatened to vulnerable, just increase the population size, maintain genetic diversity, do all the things that we've been talking about, okay? Now, these recovery plans can involve many different things. Maybe it's an in situ recovery plan where you are proposing that the habitat be turned into a nature preserve. And that's your recovery plan. It'll let the populations that are there that are endangered recover. There's your recovery plan. Maybe it involves capturing, taking them to a captive breeding program, and then breeding in a more aggressive way or in a way that ensures genetic diversity. We will talk about the California condor conservation because it's a good example of a very active management plan that was successful. All right. So recovery plans, they can be expensive. Protecting a single species can have wider benefits. There's like a conventional wisdom of, hey, doing an in situ conservation project is good because in protecting that species, you're also able to protect a lot of other species in that same area. So there's this big division between in situ projects and ex situ projects. Maybe I'll write it on the board since I keep saying the words. And it gives the people watching the recording something to look at too, you know. In situ versus ex situ. I'm trying to write those in italics, and it just made my handwriting look worse. You know, it's okay. It's all right. Back in my day, we used to have to do these writing projects where you had to write the same sentences in, you know, italics and then in all caps, and it was a great assignment. It was just so much fun. Yeah, now, I mean, honestly, you just underline it now, and that indicates italics, or you could like put a parenthetical behind it. But why would you do that? You just type it. It's silly.
The better way to put it was I thought that italics was a typing thing.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah. No, writing in italics is horrible. It's really, it doesn't, your brain wants to correct the writing, and you end up with stuff that like this. I tried to turn my head sideways to make it work. It didn't work.
It makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Fun.
I wrote italics on accident.
I'm just happy they're not making you do cursive anymore. That was a nightmare.
Except now we don't know how to read it.
Yeah, but that'll all go away. Take a picture with your phone, it'll translate it. It'll be fine. Yeah. All right, cool. So here we go. Protecting a single species can have wider implications, can have wider benefits. Sometimes you've got a habitat that's endangered, but it's kind of, honestly, you don't see as many habitat conservation projects getting as much attention, right? If you think about endangered habitat types, it doesn't really springs to mind. I don't know about for you, but I mean, for me, it's like, oh, I think of a peat bog, and that's like the one thing I think about. But if you think about endangered species, you might think of the lowland gorilla or the giant panda, all these cute, charismatic, interesting animals, the snow leopard, right? All these things. So these are examples of what we call either umbrella or flagship species. Really more of an example of flagship species, but flagship species end up being used as umbrella species. So check it out. You go into a habitat, the entire habitat is threatened. People are taking tons from that habitat. You want to get a conservation project implemented, turning it into a nature preserve. You just want to go. Let's go hands off. Let's put up giant fences, you know. I mean, no, it's an exaggeration, but you can't get any traction on that. Then you realize, oh, there's this really cute, charismatic animal here. We're going to make it the flagship species. It is a charismatic surrogate species, like this mountain gorilla here, that people want to protect. All right? Now, that protection of that species helps to protect other species. It's really good if your flagship species has a broad range throughout the habitat, if you can demonstrate that, oh, it moves around a lot, and also if it's reliant on a lot of other species in the area. The more connections it has, the more you can say, well, if we're gonna protect the gorilla, we gotta also protect this plant. And if we're gonna protect that plant, we gotta protect its pollinator. And if we gotta protect its pollinator, we have to protect the birds that are eating the pollinators that compete with it. So, you know, we gotta just expand that protection a little bit. And that turns it into a good umbrella species, okay? Protection of one species results in protection of other species. I already talked about keystone species, and keystone species is more of you're trying to carry out a conservation project. You're trying to get public approval. You're trying to get people who aren't ecologists to buy into not accessing resources, all right? Saying, oh, well, it's a keystone species. It's connected to, it's a big node in the food web, you know? It's got a lot of connections. Let me show you the connectivity of this food web and how essential it is. Might not always work as much as you show this picture and the people are excited about it. You see what I'm trying to say? So keystone species are essential for protection. We know that, we've established that already. But we've got these additional categories of the flagship species, like giant panda, gorilla, all right, something charismatic, snow leopard, all right, and then the umbrella species where if we can get protection for this one species, other species get protected. So sometimes when you see a conservation project and you're like, why are they protecting that species? Like, why are they targeting that one species of ground squirrel? Do they really care about that ground squirrel's role in the ecosystem? Maybe not. Maybe that species is being used as an umbrella species because conserving its habitat will protect species that are actually maybe not even already endangered, but at risk, or will curtail development projects that are putting habitat types at risk. Anyway, it's something to think about. You can care about the more complicated picture and accomplish it by getting protection for an individual species. Awesome. Keystone species. We've talked about it. Everybody does the sea star. It eats all sorts of stuff. All right? It's a keystone species. If you remove it, then it's going to have a huge impact on the ecosystem. Usually because it consumes many things or it's consumed by many things. All right? Somebody in the comments wrote that they really liked the learning of the keystone in the bridge and what that actually meant, right? Where the term keystone came from. And I was so stoked to hear that because it's pretty interesting. It does sort of drive the whole point home. I was like, yeah, if that keystone's not there in the arc of the bridge, the entire structure falls. And similar for the keystone species that we discuss. All right? Cool. Yeah. Oh, I had more about this, and I deleted the other slides, but I left this, which is referencing a researcher that I no longer reference. So let's just move past that one slide. Okay. Keystone species. How do we feel about them? It's all right? Solid. I love it. Umbrella species. Okay? You protect this one species, you have to protect its whole habitat. So you protect whole habitat types, or you protect a bunch of other species. You know, it's good stuff. It's good stuff. So umbrella species. I've titled this slide Ranking Species for Protection because if you're prioritizing which species in a community you're going to really push for, you're going to try to get protection for, it would make sense to prioritize umbrella species, where their protection will result in the protection of other species in the area, right? That way you don't have to draft 15 different conservation projects for 15 different species. You just protect this mountain lion or puma here, and then it ends up protecting the other ones that you were aware were endangered. Umbrella species. Look, it's in an umbrella. No, it's trapped in there. Somebody let this poor cat out of this umbrella. All right, awesome. Usually, when you're laying out recovery plans, the brick wall you run up against is, well, we have to consider the economic impact of the recovery plan. So the Endangered Species Act prevents taking of these animals or harming of these endangered species, but in practice, countries can, or not countries, but even local governments, companies can lobby that, well, the actual impact of that species undergoing more loss here is offset by the economic benefit of, say, building this dam, okay? And you'll commonly get those pushbacks. Those pushbacks will have a little bit more traction when the species that is being targeted for protection isn't charismatic. Like it's a bug or an unpleasant fish. People just go, okay, yeah, I'm okay with that not being in that water anymore. You know, see what I'm trying to say? We're going to also talk about the impact of, so this slide exists to say, hey, officially there is an economic consideration as well when you're implementing these recovery plans. So it needs to be considered because you need approval to implement these conservation projects, right? These recovery plans that we've been talking about. We're going to also talk about some more complex ways that economic interests can be leveraged to prevent conservation projects. Anyways, we'll get right to it before very long at all. Okay, so hey, check this out, right? Using the Endangered Species Act, implementing these recovery plans. If it's public land, it's traditionally more simple than implementing on private land, all right? Implementation on private land, okay, is much more complicated. So here we've got 80% of habitat for more than half of all listed species is on non-public property, okay? On your private land, the Endangered Species Act still says that you can't destroy habitats, all right? But you can do a lot, okay? You can also purchase private land and then just buy extra and then develop a large portion of it, but then set aside another portion of it as a preserve. And boom, now you've just benefited the endangered species because you've created a new nature preserve, or you've promised not to harvest this patch of woodland for a given period of time. But you've also developed this other patch over here when none of it was going to be developed before you purchased it. You see what I mean? So it gets really complicated when we're talking about private land, and all of the different rules don't necessarily apply. So the Endangered Species Act, things like this, can't always be enforced when the land is owned by a private entity. Okay, cool. So we'll start on Wednesday. It's Monday, right? On Wednesday, we'll start with some ex situ conservation projects for species. We're basically going to be talking about breeding programs and gene banks. It's going to be pretty cool. People like the gene banks talk, I think. You know, it's going to be interesting. We'll talk about the condor. It's going to be awesome. There's a condor puppet being used to feed a baby condor. That's what we'll end on today. Have a good rest of your Monday, and I will see you on Wednesday. Don't forget to keep working on your annotated bibliography. Don't forget on Fridays to participate in the discussions. Thank you all for making it, and I hope you just all have a wonderful rest of your day.